This event today is being hosted by Luton Momentum. A lot of people do ask, what is Momentum, what are we about? And I suppose the easiest way to sort of describe Momentum is we like to think of ourselves as the activist branch. You had the Angela Eagle incident a few months ago in Luton, and from that we realised that there was a need to have an organisation in Luton which supports Jeremy Corbyn and what he stands for. It's from that Luton Momentum was born, and for the last few months we've done various things in support of the principles Jeremy Corbyn stands for, as well as other matters that we think are important, austerity issues, freedom issues. I mean, we've always backed a lot of the national demos that have happened in London, such as you have the Trump demo, you have the Palestine issues that are going on, etc. Now, coming back to a topic at hand, we have here today Youssef El-Gingihy, who's come down to speak about the NHS. Youssef is a doctor himself. He's got a book that he's publishing, and he'll be telling you about that too. And he'll be able to give you a grassroots breakdown of exactly what is going on from the internal side of the NHS. I mean, for all of us, we're like the end users, aren't we? We see it from the outside. We're the ones who suffer, but we're not the only ones suffering. I think it'd be fair to say that doctors are suffering also. And so it'd be very intriguing to hear what is going on the inside and to help us to gauge how we can address it from the outside. So with that, I'm going to lead on to Youssef. And the structure for today is, once Youssef finishes, we're going to have a brief circulation of questions and comments. And really what this is about today is a discussion. We're all here today. All of us could have some really good ideas of how we can mobilise, how we can come together and challenge this. So it's not a case of myself or Youssef or anybody else sitting up here and telling you this is what we're going to do. It's not about that. We're all a community, many parts making one whole, and it's all about all of us coming together as a community, mobilising, swapping ideas, and maybe putting an action plan in place of what we're going to do over the coming weeks, coming days, coming months, to work against cuts such as this. So on that note, Youssef.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to Luton. I've never been here. So just a little bit about my background. I'm working as a GP in Tower Hamlets, so East London. And a few years ago I got involved really in what was happening to the NHS. And it'd been happening for about 30 years actually. And I started getting involved in campaigning and writing about the really dismantling the destruction, the privatisation of the NHS, and eventually got around to writing this book, which is obviously a tongue-in-cheek title, How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps. It's not actually a blueprint. Those blueprints were, as we all see, produced some time ago, unfortunately. And after, kind of in a cruel twist of fate or irony, after I wrote the book, this was after it came out, so about a year and a half ago or so, so the summer of 2015, I was given a serious diagnosis myself, and then ended up having several months of life-saving treatment from the NHS, which kind of underlined really the message, which is that you never know when either yourself or one of your loved ones will need it. Probably the kind of harshest way of finding out that message, but nonetheless it does remind us of that harsh reality. Now, the main kind of narrative in the book is trying to show that over the past 30 years, this has been a very gradual process. The NHS has been converted from its original remit, which was a public healthcare system. By that we mean publicly provided, publicly funded, publicly owned, and it's been converted from that into a market system. And all the evidence shows that market forces don't work very well in healthcare. And we've discovered that here in the UK, in the NHS, over those 30 years. And across the world, there is quite a lot of evidence that points to that. Unfortunately, the policies that have been rolled out by successive governments have been driven not by evidence, they've been driven by ideology. And that ideology believes that deregulated markets should run everything, all public services and everything in the economy, and particularly in the NHS, but I think obviously much more widely, it's been pretty disastrous, hasn't it? I think we saw that in the 2008 crash. But back to the NHS. This journey, just to kind of try and map it out, started in the 80s with outsourcing of things like cleaning and catering and laundry. And the first big step really was following the 1990 Act. So that was introducing a limited market in the NHS, and the justification was that if you bring in competition, private sector, etc., you will improve efficiency, you'll reduce costs, and so on. But in fact, the opposite happened. So the Department of Health actually knows all of this because they commissioned studies on it, which was back in the early zeros, which showed that the complete opposite had happened, that bringing in the market into the NHS had actually escalated costs hugely. And one of the reasons for that is the profit motive. The moment you bring in private corporations, companies, then profit is obviously their main driving force. And we'll try and come back to that idea in a bit. So that was really the first big step. New Labour came in with Tony Blair, obviously in '97, and they actually, I was 16 at the time, so a lot of this happened really when I was, otherwise engaged, but woke up to the gradual effects of this in the last few years. But New Labour promised to abolish that limited market back in '97. But from 2000, they actually did the complete opposite, unfortunately. And they expanded that limited market into an extensive market. And I think it's important just to distinguish really between what Jeremy Corbyn and the current leadership has been saying, which is to back the renationalisation of the NHS, making it public again from New Labour. I think it's important not to get confused that the two are in any way in agreement on NHS policy. But back then, 2000 onwards, they expanded that limited market into an extensive market. And one of the main things that happened was something called public-private partnerships, and the best example of that is something called PFI. How many people here have heard of PFI, know what I mean by it? Okay, a few people, good. So that's the Private Finance Initiative. Just to explain it, it basically meant that you privately finance infrastructure, including hospitals, but it applied to schools, prisons, railways, roads, and so on. And hospitals were actually the biggest part of it. Over 100 hospitals were built through PFI. Previously, you would have publicly financed those hospitals or other infrastructure. And instead, the money was now being put up by big banks and other financial companies. And then the hospitals were actually built by construction firms, and then they're run by facilities, what are called facilities management companies. So you basically have a consortium of companies, of corporations, running quite a large number of our hospitals now. For example, where I work in Tower Hamlets, we've got, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate claim to the biggest PFI in the country at Barts and the Royal London Hospitals, which are kind of historically famous, world-famous hospitals, but they are basically now effectively run by a corporate consortium, which is called Skanska Innisfree. And if you do a bit of digging, and the more I discover about PFI, the more kind of you realise how much there is to know and how shocking it is. But Innisfree, which is this financial company that is part of the consortium, is a very small company. If you go on their website, they employ something like 30 people. These are not companies in the City of London that are creating huge growth or jobs or anything like that. This is pure wealth extraction from public services and from the taxpayer. But essentially, that hospital alone, if you publicly finance those, well, it's actually more than one project. It's several sites, obviously, because it's a very big trust. But if you publicly finance the new hospitals at Barts and Royal London in East London, it would have cost about £1 billion. But instead, because it was privately financed, it will end up costing £7 billion by 2049, to be precise. So you're talking about £6 billion. And where does that £6 billion go? Well, every week, my local trust is paying over £2 million in interest, just on the interest on that. Basically, what is a mortgage? What is a scandalously, ruinously expensive mortgage? That money goes to that consortium. And if you again start tracing all of that further back, you'll find that Innisfree, the main shareholder is Coutts UK, which is the Queen's Bank. But more importantly than that, Coutts is owned effectively, or Coutts UK, I should say, is owned by RBS. And you'll remember that in the crash, obviously, RBS was bailed out to the tune of about £45 billion. Has since incurred over £50 billion in losses. It's just been announced that they've lost, I think, another £7 billion, hasn't it, recently? So the kind of bailout and losses of RBS alone are equal to about the NHS budget for a year. And yet RBS and other banks, HSBC, Barclays, are continuing to make significant profits along with these other companies, and we're talking about profits ultimately that are going to be in the tens of billions and hundreds of billions even for all of PFI over the coming decades. So it's a really shocking story, and it's once you understand something like PFI and everything else that's happening that you begin to realise that, for example, all the recent reports about health tourism are just a complete distraction, because health tourism is about you have to first of all talk about the fact that a lot of health tourism is actually legitimate health tourism, in that we have reciprocal agreements with other countries, in the same way that if I was a tourist and I got ill, or any of us got ill in Europe, for example. So a lot of health tourism is legitimate, but as a proportion of the budget, it's about 0.5, something like that, is what the Department of Health is trying to recoup, is 500 million. It's about 0.5% of the NHS budget. And when you start dealing with PFI, you realise that the real damage is being done from the corporate and financial establishment. So for the whole country, just to kind of make it more depressing, the UK's PFI debt is over £300 billion right now. So that's for all the infrastructure that was built for PFI, not just NHS hospitals. And that's only going up because George Osborne introduced something called PFI 2. Sounds like a blockbuster sequel, but it's only public services that are going to get blown up, not movie villains, unfortunately. So over £300 billion, to put that into perspective, because it's such an astronomical figure, you kind of lose any conception of what it means. It's 4 times the size of the budget deficit that was used to justify austerity in the first place. So what that kind of begins to make us understand is that austerity is a choice. It's not a necessity. That if you dealt with something like PFI, you wouldn't need to have the kind of massive cuts to public services that we've seen over the past few years. So that's I think enough probably on PFI. But during that period, so 2000 up to 2010, the market was also expanded within the NHS in other ways. So we saw a lot more outsourcing. We saw, for example, in GP out-of-hours services, private companies taking over some of that. We saw private companies coming in and doing all kinds of things like diagnostics, particularly, so things like MRI scans, and huge problems, to be honest, with many of those examples, so around quality and so on. So, for example, with MRI scans, the Royal College of Radiologists said that the quality of the scans and the reporting was so poor that they ended up, from these private companies, that they ended up having to repeat a lot of them. So that gives you an idea of what we've seen where privatisation and private companies have been involved. And one of the things that happened at that time was something called the Concord Act, which made private companies basically permanent fixtures in the NHS. And one of the architects beyond Alan Milburn, who was a new Labour Health Secretary, was Simon Stevens, and we'll come back to him in a minute, but he's currently running the NHS, just we'll come back to what he did next, because it's very illuminating. Now, since 2010, we've obviously had the coalition and really Conservatives in charge, and we've seen an acceleration since 2010 of privatising the NHS. And the flagship thing that happened really in the last Parliament was something called the Health and Social Care Act 2012. Again, how many people have heard of that? Few people, okay, a bit less than PFI. Not getting clearly the publicity it needs. But the Health and Social Care Act is basically the most important piece of legislation that's happened in the NHS since its creation. And what it is a privatisation act. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that because, the BBC, for example, on the day it came out, covered it as new act gives powers to GPs. I think was how it was described. It's actually a privatisation act. The reason I say that is a number of reasons. One, it basically acts as the government's responsibility to provide an NHS. That's the first thing. It then devolves that responsibility to a number of bodies. You might have heard of them. So, for example, your local CCGs, the clinical commissioning groups, or the kind of higher-up bodies such as NHS England. But it devolves the responsibility, supposedly, to those bodies. But it very cleverly starts to undermine the responsibility the ability to provide a comprehensive service, so to provide healthcare, really comprehensive healthcare for everyone. And we're starting to see that, aren't we? So we're seeing local NHS services, local CCGs up and down the country now, significant ramping up of rationing, but we're also seeing them coming out with consultations. I know this is happening in a number of places. Richmond is the one that immediately comes to mind in I guess that's southwest London, isn't it? Where they've come out and they've said that we're going to start rationing things like cataracts, hearing aids, hip and knee replacements, treatment for obese patients and smokers, and so on. And we're seeing that in a number of other places, and that's only going to increase. And so that's what we mean by the law now, the legislation enabling rationing and of care. And undermining comprehensive care. Now, the third thing, which has perhaps received the most attention that this Health and Social Care Act does, is it opens up NHS contracts to unlimited privatisation. So it's unlimited, really, outsourcing, if you want to use the soft word to describe privatisation. And we're seeing the numbers on that shoot up. So the most conservative estimate, which is from the Department of Health, is that about £9 billion now of the NHS budget is outsourced to private companies. But that doesn't include other areas. So it doesn't include, according to those figures, general practice, dentistry, pharmacy, for example, and other bodies such as, when you get too technical because it gets a bit dull, doesn't it, but the Centre for Health and the Public Interest puts that outsourcing figure at much higher, at about £20 billion. So obviously you start to get a few differences, but the point is that significant chunks have now been outsourced. And if you go back to 2010, before the Act, that number was about 4 to 5 billion. So you've seen a significant shooting up of that as a result of opening up the contract. And what that does is it means that companies like Virgin, I was in Bath the other week, and Virgin have won a big health and social care contract there, which runs into kind of hundreds of millions. And they've won these contracts all over the place, along with Serco and other companies, United Health, etc. And what it does is these private companies come in, you'll remember David Cameron, I'm sure Theresa May probably say the same thing now, but you'll remember David Cameron stood at the dispatch box and said, it doesn't matter who provides NHS services as long as it's free at the point of delivery, which sounds very persuasive, doesn't it? The reality is that if you tender these contracts out, if they go to private companies, Virgin and so on we've all seen the pictures, haven't we, of Richard Branson kite surfing with Obama, but pretty nauseating. But Virgin and other private companies will cherry pick, what's called cherry pick, the low-hanging fruit. So they will go for straightforward services, community services, for example, cataracts, joint replacements, what's relatively straightforward healthcare. They're not interested in complex, risky healthcare, such as emergency medicine, so A&Es, obviously, acute medicine, intensive care, all of that stuff, transplant surgery, children's medical care, for example. So the result of that is that once you outsource those contracts or those services, if you're talking about, for example, Luton and Dunstable Hospital, which I understand is your local hospital, isn't it? That hospital, like any NHS hospital, will make its money, as it were, from the straightforward stuff. So if you permanently outsource that or outsource it, you get the money from that. It's just being siphoned off as profits for Virgin or Serco. And the hospital is now left anywhere in the country with much less money to provide the rest of the services, so to provide particularly the complicated things like emergency medicine, intensive care. So it's a very clever and insidious way of undermining the NHS. The fourth thing, which really didn't receive any publicity, the kind of fourth and final thing to mention with the Health and Social Care Act, is that it lifted the cap for how much hospitals could make from private patients up to about half. Previously, NHS hospitals couldn't make more than 2% of their money from private patients. It's now pretty much half, 49% to be specific. And if you now go to some of these big centres in London, the two-tier system, the kind of nightmare that people like myself are warning about, is already here. You've basically got big London world-famous hospitals where you have increasing, expanding private wards. You have actually less and less NHS wards. Private patients are brought in fast-tracked, sometimes for kind of life-saving cancer treatment, for example, and NHS patients are actually being turned back. So that is the reality already on the ground, just speaking to kind of colleagues who work at some of these places. So these are all the appalling effects of the Health and Social Care Act. Kind of 2015 onwards, obviously we now have a Conservative government in charge. They have really gone about very aggressively consolidating what has happened since 2010, really, or before. And what we're seeing now is that Simon Stevens, whom we mentioned earlier, is now the runs the NHS. He's basically the NHS boss. The official title is Chief Executive of NHS England. He was advisor to Alan Milburn, and he was then main health advisor to Tony Blair. So he was the main health advisor in Downing Street when the market was expanded. He then went off, he was rewarded through the revolving door to work for United Health, who are one of the biggest private healthcare and insurance companies in the world. In fact, one of the biggest corporations in the world, full stop. So they're an American company. They're in the kind of Fortune or Forbes top, 20, not Forbes, Fortune top 20, top 25 corporations. They've been doing very well recently. So when I wrote the book, I was working on that back in, a couple of years ago now. Their revenues were about $70 billion, dollars, I guess, a year. It's now about 150 billion, so they've done very well over the past few years. And when Simon Stevens was there, he was there for the best part of 10 years, a decade. He was personally involved in lobbying on their behalf for all kinds of things. So lobbying to expand United Health into Europe and into Asia, making them a partner in NHS contracts. He lobbied for TTIP, which, how many people have heard of TTIP again? Yeah, good. It's getting there. So TTIP is the EU-US trade agreement, which would lock in privatisation of public services, but particularly something like the NHS. We won't get into the technicalities, but Simon Stevens lobbied again for TTIP. He lobbied against Obamacare. Now, Obamacare wasn't some kind of public universal healthcare system, but they did put a public option on the table to compete with the insurance plans, and United Health and others, obviously in the US private healthcare and insurance industry, nuked that public option, basically. And so that's what kind of Simon Stevens was up to, and at least what United Health was doing when he was there for the best part of 10 years. He's now come back through that revolving door and is running the NHS, and I think he was reappointed in 2013 or 2014. Since then, since 2015, NHS England have produced a document, a 5-year plan for the next 4 years now, isn't it, or 3 years, up to 2020. And that 5-year plan, if you've got a minute, it's called the 5-year forward view. Have a look at the executive summary. It specifically states that the NHS should now copy US healthcare, and it states that it should copy what are called accountable or integrated care organisations. Now, very helpfully, that was just a document, but Simon Stevens, when he went up in front of Parliament on Monday, in front of the Public Accounts Committee, actually said this in his own words. So it was very helpful that he's put it out there in the public domain. He said specifically with these new STPs that we'll come back to, the Sustainability and Transformation Plans, we should start rolling those out now as accountable care organisations or integrated care organisations. And you'll hear a lot more about integrated care, and I'll come back to it. Hopefully I won't overrun, because there's usually, there shouldn't be too much risk, because I think my fellow speaker unfortunately hasn't done. But integrated care is basically, how many people have seen Michael Moore's Sicko, the documentary he did about US healthcare? A few hands. Okay, it's on YouTube, so I really urge you to watch that, and that will tell you a lot about what integrated care is. But Michael Moore uses the example of Kaiser Permanente, who are a US California-based organisation, and they're what's known as a health maintenance organisation or an integrated care organisation. And in the middle of the documentary, you'll probably, for those who've seen it, remember that there's a segment with two patients, one of whom is a child, who end up dying, and the other is speaking to the widower of a man who dies of kidney cancer. And in both cases, basically, treatment was withheld. So life-saving treatment was withheld by I think it was Kaiser Permanente in the film, so by integrated care organisations. And in the US, the idea of integrated care is that you cut costs by restricting access to hospitals or specialists, and that's what's now being rolled out here. So it's being sold as integrated care, which sounds like a great buzzword, doesn't it? Like all the rhetoric for these things, whether it's markets increasing efficiency and reducing costs. Who's going to argue with integrated care? It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It sounds like joined up care, but that's not what's on the table. What's on the table is US-style integrated care, which of course is why we've now seen these STPs. Again, just to get an idea, with sustainability and transformation plans, which obviously have the potential to affect here. How many people are aware of that? Because that's the kind of latest kid on the block. Good. So sustainability and transformation plans is integrated care. So what they are doing is, again, there's a whole lexicon, a whole glossary of these terms that really don't mean anything. They're just, well, they do mean a lot, but they're euphemisms. So sustainability, you'll hear a lot about how the NHS is now unaffordable and unsustainable. That's basically completely rubbish. The original model as a publicly provided, funded public healthcare system is pretty much the cheapest model of providing healthcare. It's the most cost-effective model. If you speak to kind of academics, health economists, public health people, that's what they'll tell you, that's what the evidence shows. And that's why, for example, we're spending about 7% of our GDP, of our economy, on the NHS. Because compare that to European countries, Western European countries are spending about roughly, give or take, about 10%. If you go over to the US, which is the most privatised system, they're spending about 16 to 18% of their economy on healthcare. And that gives you an idea that the more that you privatise the healthcare, the more expensive it becomes. So the US model is actually the most unaffordable, unsustainable model. Yet we're seeing these plans being rolled out, and we're being told that we need more cuts. So more sustainability, which is the cuts part. So the plan is for £22 billion in cuts by 2020 for the NHS alone. That's on top of, don't be misled again by the mainstream media's presentation of this, or the government's line, which is that we've ring-fenced. They keep saying we've ring-fenced the NHS budget. Of course, healthcare budgets have to go up in proportion with the needs of the population, so as the with various factors. So if you freeze that budget, if you ring-fence it, it's basically a cut in real terms. So we've already seen about 15 to 20 billion pounds in the last Parliament, so up to 2015 in these cuts. And now they're rolling out this next 22 billion. So in total, the NHS will have endured something like 40 billion pounds in cuts by 2020. And of course, when you saw the British Red Cross declaring a humanitarian crisis in the NHS at the start of the new year, it's not surprising, is it? Because that's what happens when you bring in that level of cuts. Unfortunately, it's not just cuts or underfunding, which is the issue. So that's where the second part of these plans comes in, transformation. Transformation is basically integrated care. So it's this US model of healthcare. It's basically privatization. And it means that you will end up seeing tens of hospital trusts across the country now facing closures, downgrades, mergers. So according to the Daily Telegraph, for example, there's about 66 hospitals across the country facing closures or downgrades. And you're seeing also hundreds of GP surgeries have already either been closed, merged or taken over. So I think the figure is about over 650 GP surgeries have already since 2010 either been closed, taken over or merged. And now up to another 600 could close by 2020. So that's the picture for both hospitals and GP surgeries across the country. And the reason behind this is, again, it's helpful when you look at the coverage really in the health trades press. They're much more open about what's being done compared to the coverage in the mainstream media, where you don't really understand what's happened to the NHS. It's just a picture of crisis that's presented. So in the health trades press, they talk about how essentially what's driving this is that the US market is saturated. So the US market for private healthcare and insurance is now full, and that's why companies like United Health, Simon Stevens' former employee, or employer I should say rather, are now expanding into the NHS, into Europe and into Asia. So they also talk about how the reason for this kind of pushing this US model now, this integrated care model or these sustainability and transformation plans, is that a lot of these companies like Virgin and Circle and United Health, when they opened up the NHS contracts even more in the last Parliament, what these companies found was they weren't making the kind of profits they actually wanted to make from NHS contracts, unsurprisingly, because healthcare isn't necessarily that easily profitable at first. And so a lot of the restructuring we're now seeing, like closing down hospitals and smaller hospitals, particularly in GP surgeries, is about basically creating new models. So it's about creating, according to another government review, chains of super hospitals, so big hospitals, and you'll have them in chains, and creating networks of GP surgeries. And again, this is all sold as being better, about improving services or patient care. The reality is that if you're a private company, so if you're either a multinational or a private healthcare company or a private equity firm, for example, you don't actually want to take over a small single-handed GP surgery, for example, or a small kind of cottage or district hospital. What you would like, if you're Virgin or United Health, is to take over a whole chain, so a whole network. That's much more profitable for them, and that's what's kind of quite openly discussed in the health trades press, or even sometimes in the Financial Times. And so that's really what is going on right now. And in terms of bed numbers, I mean, our bed to population ratios are already, we've lost something like a third to half of NHS beds since the 80s. I think the figure I'm aware of is about half, actually. And our bed ratios are now down, bed to population ratios are worse than some Eastern European countries. So the idea that we're now going to embark on a huge programme of further hospital ward bed closures and GP surgery closures is absolutely catastrophic. But this is all part of a plan, of course. This is not kind of accidental or unintended. The idea is, of course, to create this two-tier system. So the idea is to expand private health insurance ultimately for those who can afford it, of course, and for everyone else, they will just be left with a third-class service. And I think we can already see that on the ground, can't we, unfortunately? And so that's the restructuring. I think, obviously, we saw last year the junior doctor contract, and that sadly has ended with something of a whimper, hasn't it? But that ties in with all of this. Again, the way that was presented was often in isolation as the small print of some contract dispute. The reality is it's part of privatisation. So, again, it comes back to the fundamental driving force for the market and for any private company's profit. And of course, the biggest overhead for any organisation is wages. So the whole point, really, of the redesigning the junior doctor contract is to bring down wages. It's a blatant attack on paying conditions. Those contracts will now, similar contracts rather, will be rolled out to other NHS staff. So there will be new contracts in the coming years for GPs, consultants, for allied health professionals. For example, for nursing now, for student nurses, the bursary has been axed, for example, and according to some of my nursing colleagues who are campaigning, there's a situation now where some nurses are actually accessing food banks, shockingly, is what I've been told. So, that really junior doctor year-long industrial action was very much about an attack on paying conditions for NHS staff, which comes hand in hand with privatising healthcare or any service. In terms of patients, and of course, I myself am now in that category. We're seeing now something called personal health budgets being rolled out. Has anyone heard of those, personal health budgets? Only a couple. Yeah. Okay. So they've been used in social care. They're now being rolled out for healthcare. So it means being given a pot of money for your healthcare. Right now, they're claiming that it would run concurrent to your normal NHS care. But ultimately what that leads to is opening the door for top-up payments, or what they call in the US insurance co-payments. So you'll have this fixed pot of money, but again, for those people who are affluent, who are lucky enough, who can afford it, you can then add in this at some point in the future. I think that's what it will open the door to, is top-up payments. And unsurprisingly, insurance companies like AXA have said that they're enthusiastic about these budgets. That's not surprising, is it? So, fortunately, in terms of everything that is happening, this isn't just my take on it. Fortunately, we have a number of illuminating quotes from those who are kind of the key players, the key policy makers, which confirm this picture. So, for example, Mark Britnell, who was one of the key policy makers in the Department of Health, one of the top civil servants a few years ago, went off, of course, through the revolving door to work for KPMG. He was caught red-handed at a private equity conference in the US, saying that, and I quote, "The NHS will be shown no mercy, and then the best time to take advantage of it will be in the next couple of years." This was, I think, at the time that the Health and Social Care Act was in the works. Nick Seddon, who was David Cameron's main health advisor in Downing Street, wrote, before he was the health advisor, wrote a series of articles in the Daily Telegraph where he basically stated that the NHS should be merged with insurance companies, and that those who can contribute towards their healthcare would be encouraged to do so. So he was basically clearly spelling out private healthcare insurance, and again, some kind of two-tier model. So it's very helpful to have, those are just a couple of examples of those kind of quotations, because you don't hear that kind of thing, do you, very, very often in the public statements of Andrew Lansley or Jeremy Hunt or any of these people. But usually behind the scenes there is something like this on the public record, which is very helpful. Jeremy Hunt himself, of course, co-authored a book called Direct Democracy back in the zeros with some other Conservative MPs, in which in one of the chapters, it wasn't his chapter specifically, but one of his co-authors called for basically the dismantling of the NHS, what they called the denationalisation of the NHS. So you begin to get an idea of beyond the kind of smoke and mirrors, the PR, the spin, what the key players really are thinking. And as we've said, this is of course being driven by big, powerful interests, by private healthcare and insurance lobby, particularly in the US. But it's also being driven by all kinds of other corporate interests, as we've seen with things like PFI. We're seeing other, seeing big banks, other corporations profiting from the destruction. I think that's quite symbolic, isn't it? The book's just fallen, but profiting from the destruction of the NHS. And the situation now is that if you're looking at the NHS budget, tens of billions of pounds are going off as corporate profits each year out of the NHS budget. That's not an exaggeration to say that when you look at the amount of outsourcing and you add to that the costs of PFI, when you add to that the cost of running the market, when you add to that how much is being paid, for example, to big law firms, big four accountancy firms for all the restructuring that is going on. So, for example, management consultants, their budget is about £700 million a year out of the NHS budget. But other companies are also making a killing. So I think we've kind of probably talked enough, haven't I? And I think we're trying to bring it all together, but maybe in the discussion we can hopefully think about positive solutions for all of this.
Excellent, thank you.